I'm aware that the subject matter of this video isn't exactly about current events, but ever since I've heard it, I've been wanting to do a rebuttal of sorts. In response to those who would ask after they've watch this video, why are you bringing this up years after it's been said? Well, simply put, I didn't have a proper channel then, a BitChute channel rather, or any kind of channel. And neither have I had the presence in the men's movement that I'd like to think that I do at present, at least somewhat. That would have helped. I've always been anti-infant male genital mutilation well before I began involving myself with the men's movement, and once I did, I was actually kind of glad to see that the subject has been taken incredibly seriously then and now. In contrast, perhaps, what I perceived as excuses for male infant genital mutilation by some in the so-called intellectual dark web, the IDW, some call it, the vast majority on religious grounds, it seems, it's led me to kind of flee from that sphere of so-called intellectuals and their cheerleaders, in which all the alleged rational discourse was happening, it seemed. It's like the place to actually have it. It was bad enough that it was rife with some kind of snide commentary about aspects of the men's movement, depending on who you're listening to, as well as all around the kind of so-called advocacy for men, not for being men, but, not for being men for their own sake, but only as self-sacrificial pieces of meat for the engine of gynocentric traditionalism. Now, I'm well aware that the point of the intellectual dark web has been one of civil discussion of controversial subjects, at least in theory. But it's been my perception that when it comes to the subject of MGM among the IDW or their allies and associates, they seem to be in the affirmative of that, vehemently even. So much to the point that I haven't heard any earnest argument with a truly opposing voice when it comes to that subject. I haven't heard any real debate that happens in those circles. One thing, though, I've noticed that a good number of them are of the Jewish faith, and it will range from the likes of Ben Shapiro, Christina Hoff Sommers, and Kathy Young. There's some others, I'm sure. It's understandably dangerous territory to go into, and I'm not going to descend into some kind of anti-Semitic tirade or anything like that. No. Far from it. You're not going to hear that kind of stuff from me. But I do understand that there are Jewish people out there that outright oppose circumcision, and I say more power to these people. These people, we need to hear more of their voices. I admit concern, however, that the more we close in with our criticism of the Jewish practice of the bris, the more they would kind of lob the accusation of anti-Semitism against those who would. We just want them to stop a barbaric tradition. But like I said, it's going to be delicate territory, sadly. It's going to be dangerous territory to go into. But anyway, back on track. Not even Ben Shapiro's talk with the allegedly unsupportive of infant circumcision Andrew Yang on the Ben Shapiro Show, Sunday Special, episode 49, is enough to convince me at present that there's a strong anti-MGM discussion happening within the intellectual dark web at all. When asked by Shapiro whether Yang was anti-circumcision but not for banning circumcision, Yang said that's entirely right. Ben Shapiro seemed rather content to the fact that Yang isn't in favor of banning it. Yang cites a friend's son's bris and then proceeds to go on about a parent's choice to circumcise or not, which simply nowhere near is good enough in my mind. Either you're against infant foreskins being cut as they actually permanently affect the brain and risk death in doing so across the board, or you simply aren't against it. So Andrew Yang proved to be a poor excuse of a anti-circumcision position. It is necessary to be direct and uncompromising when making the argument against male infant genital mutilation, because to do otherwise is to make nice with these people that are in complete social and political support of the violent mitigation of the male body part at a helpless stage of infancy. It's ironic to think that the very same people of the IDW that rightly call out the nonsense of genderless parenting, extremes of transgender mania, and anti-masculinity and anti-femininity viewpoints at the capacity that they do, they're the ones also engaging and making excuses of their own form of bloody gender suppression by cutting infant male foreskin um, to follow the tradition of dissuading against masturbation. So it basically amounts to a predetermined attempt to control that boy's eventual sexuality as if it was a form of evil. In my opinion, no different than how a given feminist thinks of maleness and masculinity and his sexuality. This is a parallel to those who may make the same excuses to perform FGM, which I'm betting the IDW will be more inclined to be vocal against, of course. No surprise there. But back on the point about making nice with those that think MGM is such a good idea, it tends to disgust me to think that I would have anything in common with those that openly defend such a thing and would openly admit to doing it to their own sons. I understand that civil discourse is the way to persuasion, but what people across the board need to understand is that civil discourse isn't about making nice and seeing the good in each other where they shouldn't. Civil discourse is about speaking freely and making the best case for yourself and standing your ground without physically attacking the other. And that's why I'm critical of the intellectual dark web as it stands. I'm unconvinced that the participants are willing to have any serious head-to-head argument on something as polarizing as MGM, or should be considered polarizing at least. Most of the time, this seems to be the very echo chamber that the IDW deplores, and most of the polite disagreements aren't revelatory for either. If a strong anti-MGM voice were to find itself in a discussion in this sphere, say with a Ben Shapiro or a Christina Hoff Sommers, this voice might be thrown out, I fear, as being uncivil, whereas back on places like Twitter, the pro-MGM voices can get away with being more vehement and nasty in their disdain for the anti-MGM side. We have an atmosphere of discussion in the IDW in which both sides are afraid to be confronted with having their mistakes corrected. As I stand by the idea of being resolute and unwavering in the anti-circumcision argument against those who would think it's a good idea, I'm not happy to say that this is about to be true for those who seem to be, for the most part, the voice that men seem to need in the past few years, and that voice is Jordan Peterson. This is the primary reason for this video, to confront some of the ideas I've discovered that Jordan Peterson has put forth in discussions and talks during his period of high activity the past few years, in particular on the subject of infant male circumcision. I'm not saying he talked a lot about that subject, but he did talk about the subject of sacrifice a lot. And I want to zero in on the few times he talked about of circumcision and criticize him for it. This I feel is deserved. From my understanding of what he said on the subject, Dr. Peterson practically sets the contextual groundwork for justifying male genital mutilation in the name of sacrificing the child to God. I want to make a few more things clear as well. In any appreciable capacity, Jordan Peterson has been influential philosophically to the minds of many men and women, myself included. My wife and I actually attended his talk in Minneapolis when he was doing his 12 Rules for Life tour, and I was able to tell Dr. Peterson directly that he's inspired me to plan my life more, and this is true. My wife actually got to hug him. I genuinely sympathize with the health troubles he's gone through in recent times, and I'm glad that he seems to be making a full recovery, last I've heard. I realize how untimely a video like this can be when Dr. Peterson is just trying to settle back in with his family, and the last thing it seems we need is somebody like me trying to rip him on the things he said in the past. But I haven't seen the point in delaying this video either, and I don't doubt as an academic, Dr. Peterson is resilient and capable of taking my constructive criticism of all people, impassioned as it may be on my part. Just recently, I've published a 3-part essay called Who Takes Your Sacrifice, in which I include moments firmly critical of what I perceive as Dr. Peterson's interpretation and advocacy for a self-sacrificial standard for men. The damn sacrifice, as he'd like to call it, is just what I intend to talk about more in this video, as sacrifice is the reason postulated by Peterson for the circumcision of infant boys, and how supposedly parents are good if they're willing to do that. I take no proper joy in disagreeing with Peterson over a subject like this, and I'll almost say I'm anguished to do so, but I still feel like I have to confront him on his explanations, and hopefully, with all due respect, blow it out of the water for good. Simply put, I've been meaning to do this type of video for some time now. The time seemed right to finally do it, since I recently wrote those articles on the subject of sacrifice, and this is a completely relevant, pertinent subject that kind of ties right into it. The following bit is from Dr. Peterson and Ben Shapiro's talk on Dave Rubin's show, and while I was doing my best to respectfully disagree with the Judeo-Christian arguments happening as I was first listening through, it was the point where it became about infant male circumcision that I became livid and wanted to confront the IDW on since. I've had it in my mind to rip Shapiro on this interpretation in particular, but when I revisited this talk for the purposes of doing so, I've realized that Peterson was more direct in the interpretation. He almost was the lead, which was strange. I didn't notice that before, but it has caused my ire since. To those who are annoyed by hearing Shapiro talk, I apologize and I sympathize, but it has to be done for the purposes of this video.
It's a call to physical adventure that I think people are lacking right now, but I think it's also a call to spiritual adventure in the sense that you are supposed to see how your values stack up against reality. I mean, this is the most famous story of Abraham. Well, the most famous story is the sacrifice of Isaac, and in that story, my view of that story is that I've never found that story particularly puzzling. A lot of people find that story particularly puzzling because it's God saying, go sacrifice your son. But to me, what he's actually saying is the fundamental truth. That story is the fundamental truth of raising a child and committing to something.
It's funny how this is a sacrifice on the part of Isaac, as if it were some sort of self-sacrifice or something. This may be true indirectly and to some extent, but it's funny in a sick way how the child in question is not even an individual with agency in the discussion here. It's merely property to the parent in question in this context. Note that these are the same people who are anti-abortion on the grounds that the unborn child is a life. In any case, it's not even directly the self that is sacrificed here, it's just another individual.
Because what God is actually saying to Abraham is you have to put your child at risk of death to live for a certain set of values. And then Abraham has enough faith to say, and I trust that God is not actually going to kill my child, but by committing to this set of values, I am in fact putting my child at risk of death.
Nobody is saying raise your child in a bubble. Existence has very much to do with encountering the dangers in the call to adventure that these two have been talking about up to this point. But the key point about that is to teach the child to live, not merely take the chance that the child dies.
Is your child in the world?
Yes, that's right.
And not only that, you're doing so on behalf of your family. You're doing so on behalf of your God. You're doing so on behalf of a broader purpose. And by the way, this is what it means to be, I think, an emissary, a fighter and a soldier and an emissary for the West. I think this is true particularly, as a Jew. I think this has always been true of Jews, because here's the reality. Every time my son is born, 8 days later we circumcise him. We take a baby and we pre-commit him. And we say, this is going to be your life now. Your life is, I am pre-committing you. This is me doing, what Abraham did to Isaac.
For all intents and purposes, Shapiro is saying that he, speaking for all Jews in his mind, offers his infant son's foreskins as a sacrifice to God. He's risking his own son's death in the circumcision process, where it's clear to me that he knows that there's genuine risk involved at the very least, and he's calling that being an emissary or a soldier for Western values. He thinks that putting his own son in needless danger is the equivalent of a child learning to face the possibility of death in the world? Really, you idiots talk a great deal about teaching self-responsibility in a child so they can grow up properly, and yet you feel this need to pre-commit the baby, not by their own design, but you're doing it for them. And pre-committing this child with the added bonus of the literal brain damage that actually results when an infant undergoes MGM, one must ask, why? Merely days old, and he is being pre-committed to some psychotic way to satisfy your psychotic god. What is so undesirable that a boy has to risk being killed, not even by his own hand, mind you, to satisfy this god?
Putting my child in more danger by circumcising him and making him a Jew than I would otherwise be, because Jews are a lot more danger in the world than other people.
Then don't do it, dumbass. MGM is a 100% needless danger that resembles a cult ritual, whether it's Jewish or not. You are literally displaying a sense of self-importance and conceit by bragging that you're subjecting your own son to mortality and calling it virtuous.
But that's the point, is that I'm saying to my child, I pre-commit you to this struggle. I pre-commit you to this set of values, and that does put you at additional risk. But that's also what gives you meaning. And
this is like saying one pre-commits one's son to that struggle by cutting off one of his arms at the 8th day for sheer sake of that struggle to make it through life as if that he would have to face. We've already established that a child will, by design, find his own struggles to face in the world. What you're describing here is abuse of the highest order to a child, in which you inflict in his infancy because he is the most helpless to do anything about that.
Throughout Jewish history, sometimes God doesn't find the ram in the thicket, right? Sometimes there is no ram in the thicket. Sometimes the kids die.
Right.
Okay, that is the reality of life, and it's also the reality of committing to any value system worth committing to.
It's so interesting.
What kind of strange value, what kind of sick idea of God is worth committing to that it requires a baby foreskin as a collected offering? If you're so turned on, or if God is so turned on by the idea of these dismembered foreskins, why don't you wait till you're an independent adult before you yourself can decide to lop off your own foreskin as a sacrifice to God? Nobody sane would do this, by the way, and yes, that's me admitting that too many people in the Western world aren't sane about this issue, but that's precisely why you pieces of garbage get the foreskin while they are so young, so incredibly young, that they offer no defense and not yet any cognition of their own rights as individuals. Oh, and notice that the three of them here are 100% aware that death is something that could literally happen. Shapiro admits that straight out here. And they're willing to let the baby boy undergo that. Why not chuck the baby across the room against a brick wall and see if he survives? And why isn't Dave or Jordan kind of realizing how cultish and cruel this all even sounds here? Are they so high on their biblical stories that they can't see what is plain immoral?
Because I don't know that I've heard you talk about this in the lectures, this specific issue through the biblical lens, but this is so consistent with everything else you talk about how to be a good parent, that you've got to let them encounter danger.
As much as I'm sickened by the idea that this is in total correlation with Dr. Peterson's biblical lectures, it's probably true too. And once again, like, I have to comment on this, like, let the child encounter danger. Well, don't inflict it on them first. He's going to encounter danger out there, and there's better ways to prepare him than being the danger itself.
When you were talking about that, the image that came to my mind was Michelangelo's Pieta, because what happens with Mary is that she has foreknowledge that her son will be broken by the world, and yet she offers him up to the world.
If you offer your son to the world with the actual foreknowledge that the world will break him, then you are an idiot at best. No, the real lesson is to teach the son to face the dangers of the world, this dangerous world, and survive it and become an individual worth reckoning. It's about teaching a son agency and the ability to stand alone and attain his visions and life goals and his values. Not this idea of offering him to the world, which is akin to just throwing his son into the tiger pit and calling it an act of good parenting.
And then you think, well, if a parent is doing this in a moral manner, then you are offering up your children to be broken by the world in the service of God. That's a sacrifice to God.
Dr. Peterson is directly admitting that sacrificing your child to God is a sign of moral parenting. It's a sign of good parenting. No, I'm not misreading what he says here. Dr. Peterson is well known for praising the idea of sacrifice and advocates as a standard that one must keep on making sacrifices, keep on picking your sacrifices. That's the way he puts it. And in order to grow as a person, supposedly. It's clear that he means that sacrifice is this good thing, this moral thing. So if that were the case, would it be immoral if the child survived? Is that the worst case scenario here? If making that sacrifice of your own son to God is a moral virtue, why not literally kill the child outright? Hell, why not abort? Now, I can already hear some of you saying, well, we need to keep the human race going by actually having children and stuff like that. Well, that's pretty fucking convenient, isn't it? These are the same people who say, and I paraphrase Dr. Peterson from a talk, a separate talk in which he spoke about the subject of abortion. I'm not going to go into that in depth or anything, but he says, abortion is wrong. There's no question about that. Now, again, that's a bit of a paraphrase. But so what would it take, Dr. Peterson, with all due respect, to admit that the same can be said about infant MGM? What would persuade you to say cutting your infant son's genitals is wrong? There's no question about that. And again, what kind of service does God require that is manifested in child sacrifice? And they're making this clear here. They actually consider virtuous the breaking of the child by the world, not confronting the world, fighting it, and emerge unbroken as a whole unsacrificed spirit. That's not virtuous to these people, to these three, apparently. The broken man is the goal of morals and virtue to these people. The beaten, defeated, destroyed man is the end goal of the service to God. You know, people wonder why I don't take up a religious faith.
And if you're the proper parent, then you do sacrifice your children to God, because what you want from them, for them, is to serve the highest possible value. If you love them, that's what you want.
Well, it's good to know that being a good parent is to force incredibly specific subjective ideas about morals instead of teaching children to discover objective morals on their own and to teach them to think. Good to know that values is about devaluing yourself in service to God. Now, I'm not going to show any more clips from that because I kind of want to move on here. However, I will mention that they go on about how they perceive the left as sending one's children out into the world without a pre-committed set of values, saying that the world becomes more dangerous and you'd have to protect them from everything. Well, I say it's ridiculous to assume that any competent parent won't give proper lessons about values and the potential dangers they'll have to face in this world. But you don't have to fucking interfere with your own infant son by forcibly extracting what would have been a perfectly functioning part of a sexual organ. You speak about the world breaking a parent's son. The parents that practice the circumcision of their infant son are the first complicit entities in that breaking. Imagine Mary herself hammering in the nails of the crucifixion. Parents are the very instrument of their son's disposability. Now, here's another thing I found when I was doing some YouTube searching, looking for anything in which Dr. Peterson spoke on the subject of circumcision. This one is from a YouTube channel called Graves, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it is the channel's owner interviewing Peterson here and putting it on his own channel, and not something he's kind of re-uploading off of somebody else or anything like that. But anyway, it's the only video that has the amount of views as it does on this channel for what I think are understandable reasons.
I was listening to the second to last biblical lecture that you gave, and you brought up something that I had been thinking about quite a bit, about the tradition of circumcision. And
Okay. So
what a cheerful, jolly subject, right?
why did you have the opportunity to be giving that consideration?
Because I guess I've been thinking about it and how it's still a custom that we have as a culture, and and as a culture, we make fun of other cultures who practice genital mutilation on children.
Right.
I'm assuming when you're talking about when it happens to girls, then yes, I guess you can say that. But there's been more attempt to bring male circumcision to the Africas, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, on some false notion that it mitigates sexually transmitted diseases.
And so it seems ridiculous that we would overlook that we still carry on this tradition and claim it as some sort of hygienic routine when I know that has nothing to do with it.
Right.
And
Yes.
what you were
Okay, to be absolutely fair here, Dr. Peterson does seem to be acknowledging to the degree that he does that the hygienic argument is ridiculous for male circumcision, but it's still ambiguous to me at this point whether Dr. Peterson is actively against it in any way.
saying was that it has something to do with affecting a person where they're most affected, right? Which to me, that made me think, well, this was like in terms of sacrifice, this was like the idea of sacrificing what's most important to us in a sexual way that we couldn't overcome in order to be able to be more productive somehow. Like,
Yeah, it's definitely something.
which
Apparently, sacrificing one's own sexuality leads to productive manhood somehow. This individual who Dr. Peterson is speaking to is a clear example when I say I'm not exaggerating when I say that sacrifice is a loss to be offered to a vile collector of the sacrifice. What could one possibly want and benefit from having robbed a boy of what could be an important part of his sexuality as he grows older? Who wants that sacrifice? Who outside wants that? Who takes it? People seem so enamored with this romanticized version of this idea of sacrifice. I almost said romanticized version, but that's all that's happening to keep sacrifice alive. Is that they begin tying it into everything. They begin to think everything of them is subject to sacrifice, including other people that are a part of their life. And this is manifested very strongly in the apologetics we keep getting for infant MGM. And it's not even directly a self-sacrifice because you're sacrificing another person at this point, another what is supposed to be an autonomous person. I wasn't exaggerating when I said that when all you can do is sacrifice, you eventually start sacrificing other people because they're fair game. And what better than another individual that happens to be your own flesh and blood for that sacrifice? You really must feel so good about this, all of you who advocate for this cult of child sacrifice. And of course, a big affirmative nod from Dr. Peterson. Apparently he's okay with all this.
It's definitely something. Well, it's a funny thing too, because, it's not like you can't see how these things are immediately relevant to the modern situation, because there's an endless number of young men who are addicted, for all intents and purposes, to pornography. And it's really not doing them any good.
Really, Dr. Peterson? Never mind the fact that pornography can be very helpful, let's admit it, in giving some degree of release in a world that shudders from puritanical lack of eroticism to obligatory sex with no spirit, mystery, or innocence. So they have to find their own idea of it in a pornographic expression, if at least to get through with their lives, and secondarily mitigate sexual offenses if they're at risk of happening. But by mentioning pornography, you're implying rather clearly that the reason circumcisions happen is to stop men from masturbating. It's directly an attack on male sexuality, as I see it. And no, there's nothing unnatural about masturbation. In case some of the idiots out there need a refresher, it's very much a part of male sexuality that we can admit to without admonishing men for it. I say this again for all the IDW criticism of the suppression of gender by left-wing forces. They in turn love to suppress gender physically through things like MGM.
And, some sacrifice of that would be a really good idea. And
fuck that.
I would say they all know it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it isn't obvious what you'd have to sacrifice in order to have enough, in order to develop sufficient commitment to stop doing that.
Now, it's funny how any use of pornography is defined as its own addiction, as if something that needs to stop by design. Only in a tradcon fairy tale will everybody work in gynocentric servitude to their exclusively assigned spouses with literal adventurous eroticism and sex practically for exclusive service to childbearing. But that's a fantasy more outrageous than the fantasy of sex with some cute redhead you saw somewhere, and I for one will take the redhead any day.
So it's not like these are problems that we've solved permanently, even though people like to think that they are.
No, I don't see it as being a solution to anything, but just something so powerful that it at least has carried on a tradition that we see nothing about realistically is carrying on this far into our culture, I guess.
Yeah.
This idea that male sexual imagination is a pathology, it's a defining trait of the traditional conservative that meets at the end of the horseshoe with the radical feminist who views all male sexuality as rape of women. That's how it is to me. This is same level stuff here. It's just admonishing men for being whatever their sexuality is. No, it's like they're begging for sexuality to be so bottled up that it will guaranteed explode out the other end.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing. It definitely begs the question, why does it have such longevity?
Mm-hmm.
So
anybody who doesn't pretend that sexual urges don't have a reason for existing and recognize that they come from a value-centered place and even from an experience-centered place, hell, dare I say, even from aspects of their childhood, they don't have to beg that kind of question. They have some idea of where it comes from and why it may be immoral to suppress it, Right, the rest of this video seems to kind of go on some New Testament idea about the circumcision of the heart, as he called it. Well, they kind of talk about giving up something more than the foreskin, but something that's part of our very being. Even in this symbolic context, you can't escape the spirit behind all this, which places morality at how broken one is as a standard. To have his very being suffer a loss in order to be considered moral and virtuous. Your heart, symbolically, can never be intact. It is a moral value if it is circumcised. Your broken self, your broken masculinity even, is what must be in order to be accepted by society and by God. I don't know about you, but I see nothing virtuous in this. In fact, I see every bit of it as evil as any cult that practices sacrifices in their own way. Now, they go on to read about it and say that the circumcision of the heart, that is a cutting away of sins for hopes of living a pure life. Well, this changes nothing, actually. Back on the foreskin again, the foreskin, what is to be a properly functioning male sexual organ with genuine, shameless purpose is regarded as sinful. This makes me wonder, actually. I thought their idea of sacrifice was about giving something valuable that, under normal circumstances and right of mind, nobody would just give. Why are they then giving away the sinful by their own admission? They say that they're talking about the sinful here. Why not give something the opposite of sinful? That is more properly a sacrifice anyway, since you're offering something of value for being valuable, and you attain redemption by having lost it and become broken. The moral argument is incredibly serious, and for someone like Dr. Peterson to entertain the moral argument for why people have circumcised their infants is every bit justifying it happening today. What allegedly works morally then would work morally today, else it was never moral. If we can acknowledge that at last that MGM is a barbaric practice today, we can very much say it was a barbaric practice as long as it has been practiced. It was never not rotten. It's fine to deduce why the great idiots of the past did such things, but not without an immediate follow-up that they were dead wrong. Last bit of clips I want to show you is from Dr. Peterson's Biblical Series 9, Sodom and Gomorrah. In particular, a short clip from it I found posted on one Adam Shallard's YouTube channel, in which he talks about the subject of circumcision.
My covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. That's a mystery there. Like, why that particular rite? Well, it's dramatic. I mean, it certainly affects a man where he's most concerned to be affected. There's something like that. And so it's a sacrifice that has a certain, I would say, a certain degree of unforgettability. That would be the first thing. And a certain degree of pain and threat that goes along with it. So it's not nothing.
I'm sure we can see clear now that those who speak so highly of circumcision, or those that try to explain why it was done, like Dr. Peterson is doing here, there are none under no delusions that this is a painless, health reason based or a riskless sort of procedure. You know exactly what is going to happen, and they know that it's painful for the boy, and they know that the baby will risk dying. Keep that in mind anytime that any of these people try to justify such a procedure.
That's the thing. Now, you can argue, and I think there is an argument, a case to be made about whether or not in the modern world circumcision is is something reasonable to inflict on infants. I don't want to have that conversation at all.
Why not? No, really, why not? Because it'll blow out any kind of moral argument that you're trying to make to justify generations and generations of it culturally happening to infant boys. You know, it's easy. Does the child have bodily autonomy or not? If you say yes, then you can't justify it happening under any grounds. It's directly immoral to do so. If you say no, then why is any one of you against abortions?
But I don't think that's relevant to this particular issue, because we're talking about something different. We're talking about humanity's attempt to reconcile themselves to the fact that something has to be given up in order for something else to happen, and to try to really work through that idea and to make it into a psychological reality.
Dr. Peterson, I would like to make one thing absolutely clear. No, it's not irrelevant. It's not a different subject. It's very relevant to this conversation. It's about your advocacy and worship of the idea of sacrifice to the point that you justified the imposing of such a sacrifice by a parent to his infant son for him before he is even intellectually able to think about the idea of sacrifice, under the guise of pre-committing him to some strange set of values that exalt the parent and son for having the tip of his dick chopped off. It's about fathers who are circumcised as infants getting the same procedure done to his own newborn sons just to carry on the stupid tradition. It's because there's a social hate affair of anything phallic that makes a human sexual organ of a male seem unsightly by sheer design, where it needs to be forcibly mutilated just for the sake of women's sadistic fetish for broken masculinity, both physically and spiritually. It's about tyrannical control and suppression of male sexuality in the name of service to God. Everything you're talking about, and have been talking about, ties directly to every misgiving in the modern day that still leads to too many baby boys in the Western world risking death or serious injury at the hands of others, and absolutely assure think anywhere from neurogenic shock and permanent lasting brain damage, among other things, and at the very most a violation of the child's autonomy, which is apparently no big deal to too many just because he's male. Dr. Peterson, no amount of biblical justification is enough to morally cover for the act of infant MGM for even a split second. It's wrong, and I think you even know it's wrong. But to admit that would go against your very narrative promoting sacrifice. Prove me wrong here.
And so far what we've seen in the biblical stories is that when you make a sacrifice, it's not really something personal or psychological, right? It's something external and dramatic. You give up something that you own. You don't give up something that you are or that's part of you. And it's actually more of a sacrifice to give up something that's a part of you or something that you are than to give up something that you own.
I cannot in good conscience actually advocate for finding virtue in sacrificing something that's a part of you. Sacrificing what you own is bad enough, but Dr. Peterson is right in that it is more of a sacrifice to give up something that's a part of you, something that is what you are, than what it is you own. But that is precisely why I think that sacrifice is evil. It's a demand by a collector of sacrifices to see the sacrificial subject broken and less than he is. This is no advocacy of man's whole spirit, and if men need anything desperately today, it's advocacy of his whole spirit.
But people identify with their possessions, and they need to, because otherwise they wouldn't care for them, and they need their possessions in order to live. So their possessions are in some sense integral to them. But this transformation here of an act that was external and associated essentially with possessions to something that was actually at least part of the body brings it much closer to the individual as a psychological reality. It's something like that.
Yes, and all the more reason that I can't advocate for self-sacrifice in good conscience. Before that clip, just a little bit, Dr. Peterson admitted that the distinction between external possession and what's within is a subtle one. It's subtle enough, and it's true that those things are closed together because one's property, let's go ahead and assume this is what he's meaning by possessions, by the way, in the modern world is most likely a product of one's own livelihood. Their very being, an unabashed self into attaining anything from their house to their business and anything that is kept inside the property to keep or to host as merchandise. When businesses were looted and pillaged by rioters during the summer of this year, and still apparently going on in places like Philadelphia at the time this talk was written, I can't even imagine what kind of sense of loss the owners of these businesses had. What they had going on, their livelihoods was taken as sacrifice by violent thugs, practical terrorists governed by whims, vigilante street fascists. It wasn't just something external they lost that they could easily replace them, contrary to what every apologist of the rioters seems to think. It really was a part of them. That's what a livelihood means. This is why I cannot possibly say that one must willingly sacrifice or offer an equivalent of that up. It doesn't make it virtuous if these business owners openly and willingly embrace their store's demise, and you're just letting these rioters just kind of take what they want and burn the rest down. And it doesn't make it moral to find serenity in the fact that their establishment just burned down or they had their stuff stolen.
And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. It's also a permanent marker, and I've read a fair bit about practices like tattooing and body scarification, those are very, very common practices, right? They're human universals, actually.
If you're talking about circumcision as a permanent marker for some stupid covenant, why isn't the act left to adults that have the determination to get those tattoos and such? Why inflict it on an infant? Might as well tattoo the boy at 8 days old with that logic. Also, a bit of irony here. Christians tend to go on and on about the mark of the devil and such, but they certainly seem to be okay with this mark in particular.
No matter where you go around the world, you see a couple of things. First of all, almost without exception, people wear clothing. And sometimes it's relatively minimal clothing, but often it's more decorative than protective, but it's almost inevitably clothing. And the other thing that you see is that people do scarify and tattoo themselves. And they do that in some manner to catalyze their identity, right? They're trying to transform themselves from a generic person in some sense to a person that's been designed by their own hand. It's something like that.
When an adult gets tattoos, then yes, it is by their own hand. Though that too can depend on some factors. If a scarification or tattooing is done as a tribal custom, I tend to debate whether they did it all on their own volition, all on their own hand, as opposed to anybody today that can get a tattoo on a whim. But that's the big difference between that and infant MGM. It's never by their own hand that this happens to them. It's always inflicted upon by others, upon a powerless creature, by the malpractitioner, the complicit parents, and a society that expects it under the name of anywhere from tradition to culture. There is nothing volitional about this procedure, and I'm not about to justify anything done in that fashion against one's autonomy. So this argument just ultimately, it doesn't hold up.
It's a marker of developing identity, and some of it seems to be catalyzed with pain. The modern people who tattoo, and I'm not saying that I'm in favor of tattooing, because actually I'm not, but
If you can make that kind of statement, the least you can do is say that you are not in fact in favor of circumcision. It doesn't take much.
But one of the things you do see, that people who have a tattoo do report, is a couple of things. Is that the pain is actually necessary, and that the pain is actually something that seems to establish something like a memory. So, well, it's a memory because of the pain, because you bloody well remember things that hurt. But it's also a memory because it's actually etched on you, right? It's not something that you can just abandon and forget. And so a circumcision is exactly the same thing. It's like you don't forget it because it's part of you. And so it makes a good token for a covenant. And so
the lasting mental and obviously outwardly physical changes are obvious, but those who had their genitals mutilated in their infancy, perhaps partly in fear of facing up to the fact that they were wronged upon by the powers that be, they tend to say they don't remember the circumcision. How could they in any way, like a conscious adult would? They were infants when it happened. As infants, they may experience the pain and a neurogenic shock, which is very real. But the reason that these people see nothing wrong with it is because they don't consciously really remember it like an adult, so they kind of accept it as a part of life. And they won't remember being strapped down and having their foreskin sliced with a blade. So again, you have no case here. It's not the same thing as a tattoo. It's not done consciously. It's not even remembered. No accursed covenant can justify this sort of thing morally here.
that seems to be the rationale here from speaking from a psychological perspective. It's to indicate as well that the damn thing that's happening is serious. And I think also that was the case with the earlier sacrifices of animals. It's like, modern people don't do this. Like, you don't know how serious you would take a vow if you sacrificed a goat in your backyard. You know, it's actually a very dramatic thing to do. You know, you think about it as primitive, and perhaps it is archaic, and no doubt it is.
Dr. Peterson seems to be thinking in a reverse way from me. He seems to think that a sacrifice of some animal may be primitive and archaic, and then goes to imply that sacrificing something that is directly tied to you as a person is a better sacrifice worth making. I, on the other hand, acknowledge that sacrificing some animal for some nonsense ritual, and perhaps not for food, is primitive and archaic, but it's even more primitive and archaic to sacrifice something that is of yourself. It's even more primitive to sacrifice humans.
But it's also to take the life of something and to spill its blood. That's no joke. That's something you remember, especially if you haven't done it before. And we actually don't know what we would need to do in order to take some things seriously. You know, because we all do things like make New Year's resolutions about how we're going to be better people, and we don't do it. And the reason for that, at least in part, is because we don't know how to make the sacrifice sufficiently bloody, let's say, so that we remember that it's necessary, right? We don't take it with seriousness.
You can read my articles about how sometimes sacrifice may become necessary only in that it's simply an unavoidable choice to make in circumstances as a matter of loss prevention or such. But that does not make it moral or virtuous directly in any proactive sense. Dr. Peterson acknowledges that it's bloody right off the bat here, but still doesn't seem to understand why or what that means. When you ask how much more you can make a sacrifice sufficiently bloody, you're measuring how much of a fare to give up to a monster holding you hostage. How badly do the collectors of sacrifice want one's life to be in the brink of death before they're satisfied?
We don't think, I should quit smoking because I'm going to die. And we don't think through what that means, like coughing your lungs out for 3 months in a hotel bed while your entire family is like half repulsed and horrified and sorrow-stricken at the fact that this has happened far too early. You know, we won't make that real enough to make it serious. And without that seriousness, we won't do it. So there's something to be said for rituals of seriousness. And I think this is one of them.
None of the context Dr. Peterson provides here is convincing me that infant MGM leads to any actual net benefit for man. All it does is mitigate the mockery by a conformist Western society that thinks that the male genitalia as it naturally is both ugly and sinful, or even dangerous, be it from a stupid public to practitioners of a bad religious practice. There's no positive point to this, and no amount of it being a ritual of seriousness can give it a pass. If you think I've been incredibly harsh to Dr. Peterson over this disagreement, well, regarding a subject of this delicacy, in my opinion, you can't be harsh enough to those who treat the subject lightly. Don't provide a direct answer on whether there's actually a thing you should be doing to your sons then or now, and basically make an argument for it by citing religious reasons for it. And no, you did not hear me wrong here. I did make a clear implication that Jordan Peterson was in effect arguing for infant MGM. This is because he argues without loss of enthusiasm for the advocacy of sacrifice and its alleged virtues. And when he speaks about circumcision, he never fails to talk about the sacrificial element, even go as far as saying that this is a sacrifice to God by the parent. He has a high appraisal of sacrifice and speaks of MGM with that appraisal of sacrifice intact. From this, I derive that he has a high appraisal of the act of infant circumcision. I don't see how it isn't. You might say it's only symbolic. Well, I don't doubt the importance of symbolism any more than Dr. Peterson does. Symbolism as icons of meaning motivate human beings to act and move vastly and significantly in the history of the species. It's why I don't dare underestimate it, but whereas he sees the sacrifice as a symbol of virtuous behavior, I view it as a symbol of suicide at the behest of those who desire the death of the sacrificial. I view it as a symbol of evil outright. I wish I were wrong about Dr. Peterson here. If anybody has any sources that make clear that Dr. Peterson takes the subject seriously enough and is adamantly against infant MGM, I asked them to prove me wrong. Please, publicly. If this can happen, I could admit I was wrong, publicly. Hell, I extend that same condition to the IDW in general. If there's anybody out there that speaks out against infant MGM for the right reasons, show them to me. I'd love to know them. I'd love to be proven wrong here. You know, it could be that I haven't paid much attention to the IDW as of late due to my having lost patience with some of their quaintness and hesitance to talk about difficult issues such as these. You know, but I simply haven't seen any serious advocacy against infant MGM from just about anyone there. Like, just what you saw today in these clips, as well as a bunch of femsplainers chortling and giggling about the painful shrieks of their own sons went through during their own circumcisions. You know, between that and this, I'm not seeing it happening here. There is no anti-MGM voice in the IDW. Now, once again, I don't feel any joy or glee in making a video such as this to someone I've been, all accounts, a fan of for some time now. Despite my disagreements with his attitude regarding sacrifice, I still think he says a lot of important things with regards to things like individualism, or at least anti-collectivism, and other insights. It's precisely why I've been a fan of him and respect him greatly that I feel the need to confront his ideas where necessary, because I think they're too serious for me to just pass up. That's why I made this video. And I realize once again that this is an untimely sort of video, right? I'm glad that he's back after spending 18 months in what is by all accounts turmoil in terms of health. And the last thing I mean to add is negativity to this man's name. But I think I have a point. I think what I say here needs to be said. I realize at moments that I come across as profane and a jerk, but I'd rather speak my piece with the due honesty it deserves than just shutting up because it's too soon. Anything seriously wrong idea-wise, coming from a person I happen to admire, deserves to be confronted, and that's precisely what I'm doing. So, no ill wishes to Dr. Peterson in the slightest. In fact, I want to send him my very best wishes, as I hope he goes strong with what he does for a long, long time, and coming out of this difficult situation even stronger than he was. I've said a lot, but yeah, that's basically it for what I wanted to say on this matter. I think somebody with the intelligence of Dr. Peterson needs to take this issue just as seriously as he might take abortions, or perhaps FGM even. And the same goes for the rest of the IDW, really. Hey y'all, I just wanted to add this last bit of video here. before I went ahead and started editing everything together, I was inspired kind of at the last minute somehow to do a little bit more digging into whether the intellectual dark web speaks much at all about circumcision. I was hoping to find something that clearly gives an opposing view, but sadly, yet unsurprisingly, I haven't been able to find such a thing. Maybe I'm not looking harder. I don't know. However, I did find this bit by Brett Weinstein associated well enough with the IDW that gives, well, in my opinion, a downright cowardly attempt at looking at that subject of MGM. And he tries to remain so neutral about both sides of the argument that ultimately it kind of backfires. He mocks the anti-MGM argument in a subtle, ostensibly inoffensive way. You kind of know how that is. And he gives the strangest excuse ever for why the practice of MGM even exists. And he does this in this smug evolutionary psychologist type of way, you know? So anyway, this video that I'm about to show clips of is from what I believe is called his Dark Horse live stream, I think it's called, which he hosts with his wife, Heather Haying, I think it's pronounced. I'm probably getting that wrong. Who happens to be another IDW figure. It's his actual real-life wife, by the way. It was a section from his episode 37, if I'm correct. But yeah, let's take a look real quick.
What are the roots of circumcision of infant males in the West? What are the evolutionary advantages, if any, of foreskin?
So, okay, this is where we finally get canceled. I know this discussion, and it is a catastrophe.
Yep.
Here's the key piece of information that you need.
Brett, this is not the same thing as that whole Evergreen State College debacle. Cancel culture may be real, but actually having a strong argument against a stupid one is not cancel culture. And you say it like it's like the entirety of the anti-MGM position, it's pretty mainstream or something in the United States, which I don't see any evidence of. It's kind of barely getting traction, in my mind at least. The anti-MGM people, they're probably more in fear of being canceled than the likes of you when it comes to this sort of subject. And what's the catastrophic thing about this subject, Brett? Is it catastrophic that people are actually coming out and saying that slicing off infant male foreskin causing them actual brain damage and actual risk of bleeding to death, among other things, that's catastrophic to you? I mean, it must be crazy, right? Like, what the heck? We just let them cut their baby penises in peace, right?
I have deployed years ago now on my channel something that I used to teach from, which was the adaptive test, a test to tell whether something should be assumed to be the product of adaptive evolution. And it consists of a diagnosis of whether something, a characteristic, a behavior, or a structure is complex, whether it has a cost, whether that cost can be reduced, and yet it persists over evolutionary time.
Something more important than that is the evolution of human morals and how it got to the point that we recognize that individuals have value for being individuals. And from this, we derive that they have agency, and from that, we have the top of the hierarchy of reason to not cut the damn foreskin of a helpless child off for no good reason in the slightest. It really is that simple.
The logic being, if you have such a structure, like the appendix is a complex structure that really is independently enough to suggest the role of adaptation in its creation, but to be conservative, it is a structure that can be reduced. So that is to say that the expense that goes into the appendix can be reduced over time, and yet it persists, which implies that it is paying the cost of it. And as we discussed last time, in the case of the appendix, that would also be the risk of having it.
Now, I don't know what the findings from modern studies of the appendix are exactly that shows the precise function of what an appendix used to have or even still has. But suffice to say, an appendix can be removed, and sometimes it has to be. But the male foreskin has a proper, precise function, and it has no need to actually be removed, as far as I can say, and much less at infancy. If you're stupid enough to prefer getting circumcised because anyone from the narcissistic female you're simping hard for, or that dumbass Milo Yiannopoulos who likes it that way, then do it in your adulthood out of your own volition. Make your own stupid choice as an adult. This is in no way a proper argument against inflicting it on a helpless child.
And therefore, the adaptation is of a magnitude that we can approximate, even if we don't know what the advantage is. Now, the reason I go through that is that in the case of the foreskin and circumcision, they both pass the adaptive test, which is to say the foreskin was built by adaptation. It has a value that more than covers the cost of its production.
That makes all this death and violation of the agency of baby boys so worthwhile. No amount of Brett saying that an intact foreskin passes the adaptive test can clear him from basically making MGM on equal moral evaluation to the intact foreskin. This attempt at making them equal only serves to downplay the argument from bodily autonomy and against the needless risk of killing and injuring one's male infant for being male. If I sound like I'm saying this thing over and over again, it's because it's really that simple, but it needs to be stated over and over again. And it's still not getting through to so-called intellectuals' heads.
The removal of it also has an adaptive meaning.
How many more atrocities that humans have committed on other humans in the history of the earth is Brett willing to justify by saying that it has an adaptive meaning?
The removal of it is something that has persisted over evolutionary time in spite of the cost and the risk of it.
Once again, same as Peterson or Shapiro, these people, like Brett, are not ignorant of its dangers. They know exactly what goes on.
What that tells us is that there's a tension here between values. And it may be that in some places, the value of the foreskin outweighs the risk of removal. It may be that in other places the reverse is true.
If you're giving equal credence to how different places weigh values, then you're outright engaging in moral relativism. I don't know what's worse, those who place value on risking infant death and damage to remove a foreskin as an actual value in itself, or those that try to do that neutral tap dance of false nuance that merely states that it states both sides, but refuses to admit to an objective sense of which one is right, even if you select the wrong one.
It may be that in some cultural contexts, the value of it exceeds the cost of removal, or vice versa. And so that is the kind of answer we are looking for. Anybody whose answer comes down to this is mutilation and should be halted because it has no value, has misunderstood the implication of circumcision being a long-standing practice.
Brett Weinstein, you absolute piece of shit. That's like saying Ignaz Semmelweis wanting doctors to wash their hands before surgery was simply a misunderstanding of why nobody bothering to wash their hands was a long-standing practice. Because they thought they didn't need to wash their hands because they were doctors and their hands were clean by the very design of their profession. It's like saying those who are against slavery because it is by its very nature a violation of an individual's agency and liberty are simply misunderstanding of the supposed cultural necessities that thought of slaves as subhuman property to be bartered and commanded. We just can't say that they're committing acts of evil. We need to understand the historical context and be kind of nice to it, right? It is an absolute truth that it is mutilation. It is the objective truth that this is so. The lie of the medical benefit is over. It holds no water. It never did. You're not even making that argument because you're outright aware of the danger and risk of the procedure.
Whether, it could be that the circumcision is a bit like the appendix in the sense that the thing that made it valuable is no longer present in our environment, and therefore at this point the value is not there.
I've already debunked the attempt to compare the foreskin to an appendix, so I won't repeat myself. Actually, I will. The foreskin has a proper function for men, okay? There is no actual benefit to removing it, and there's nothing but damage and risk, all needlessly undertaken. Brett comes across not as somebody stupid or flat ignorant about the subject, but somebody who embraces subjectivism and ambiguity for its own sake, not unlike the fucking postmodernists that the IDW supposedly likes to rip on. All this in the name of nuance, but nuance is not ambiguity. It isn't not having a position. Nuance has to be an aid for someone to make their case towards something, right or wrong as he may turn out to be. Brett is the opposite of that. He makes the case against having a case.
There's obviously lots of debate over the implications for disease. So there was a very popular piece of research that suggested that it was preventative of things like AIDS. It may be that hygiene compensates for that advantage. It may be that that data did not indicate what people thought it did, that the methodology was no good.
You couldn't be this stupid or ignorant. The hygienic argument is long debunked. I don't even think Jordan Peterson even believed that held much water. And once again, what Brett is doing here is tap dancing in desperate avoidance of making a case here. If this is what the IDW is about, count me the hell out.
So it is a very complex environment. But the thing you want, look, if you're going to walk away from the Dark Horse podcast with something to say on this topic that will make you more enlightened than other people, it is that both the foreskin and its removal are adaptive, right? That doesn't tell you which context you should expect preservation versus removal, but it does tell you you're looking for something at least complicated enough to deal with that set of truths.
Irony is the intellectual dark web telling me how to be enlightened. Likewise, ironic is him passing a standard of ambiguity and taking on no positions as enlightenment. Hiding behind what Brett calls complex is just evading the possibility that he could be dead wrong. By the way, if it's contextually appropriate, it so happens that Brett is Jewish too, and obviously I had no indication that he's against the practice whatsoever. If he was, he would have said so outright. You know, there are Jews out there, like I said, that are against this stuff and this MGM, and more power to them. A simple, I'm personally against it approach, feeble as it is at least something. Even that milksop Andrew Yang did that. It's perfectly reasonably, rationally, and morally valid to take the position of actually being against infant male genital mutilation across the board, regardless of cultural mindset. Individualism and liberty extend to all humans, and so should concern of an individual's agency and bodily autonomy. I slightly disagree with some who say that individualism and liberty is a Western cultural phenomenon in a way that says that it's exclusively so. But I, on the other hand, believe that individualism and liberty transcend culture. I think it's a global thing, or that it can be. It transcends things like West and East. It's a worldview, and it is right. My claim here is an expression that encapsulates the entire point of fighting moral relativism, at least in my mind. But back on subject. What's more, the way Brett Weinstein dismisses the anti-MGM argument and shills for the cultural and religious standard for inflicting this mutilation in practically cowardly fashion shows that he's a fucking gynocentrist that's just like anybody else thus far in the IDW. Let it not be said that gynocentrists are all traditionalists, and some are progressive left libertarian bleeding hearts like Brett. And part of course, when it comes to gynocentrism, they all advocate for male disposability, or at least excuse it, even at 8 days old. And part of the course, when it comes to gynocentrists, they all advocate for male disposability one way or another, or at least excuse it, even at freaking 8 days old. Now, Brett has joked about being canceled for saying what he did here, but that's pretty indicative of how much he was aware of the sort of thing he's bound to expect. The popular perspective, rather, would normally be people who worship the IDW because they've become popular arguing against political correctness in their own politically correct way, riding on the coattails of those who say something dangerous, but it needs to be said, and probably got in trouble for it, so everybody else is just kind of like doing this from a safe angle here. These people, these fans rather, the people I said worship the IDW, they're no less gynocentric and no less blue pill than the average person plucked from society at large. And as far as dissenting voices, to Brett's position here, as resolute as they are, they're still too few. And Brett doesn't look threatened at all to me. But when more voices actually confront people like Brett about their bullshit explanatory gymnastics that advocate for irresolution and minds so open anyone can stick their dirty hands in, like the doctors Semmelweis was trying to warn, he's not being canceled. This is not canceled. This is not cancel culture. What it rather is slamming these people with the truth, with the very freedom of speech that these people allegedly advocate for. You in the IDW, are you so afraid of being wrong? In fact, I extend this question to everybody in the IDW. Are you just so afraid of being wrong here? If facts don't care about your feelings, as Ben Shapiro is fond of saying, then it should work the other way around. Discuss the subject of MGM with the seriousness that it is due, with the same vigor that you might with abortion. Is it right or isn't it right? I take the position that it is not right, and I challenge the IDW for being cowards about this particular subject. They hide behind culture and religion and tradition to justify blatant barbarism excused for male children, while they may very well say that FGM is a horrible abomination. That last part is true. It is an abomination, but so it is for men. It is time that the IDW come to terms with its flagrant gynocentrism and be ripped for it.